All right, we got a great one in store today, joined by Sam McAfee. Sam, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, give folks a little. I know you've had a sort of roster of cool experiences, but give us the kind of quick background of your journey and what you're working on now.
Yeah, I'd love to. If people think of product development in the digital world in terms of the now frequently mentioned product trio, product engineering and design, I would say that I started and I'm still firmly rooted in the engineering side. And I also have done product for many years. So I kind of straddle those two legs of the stool. I know enough about design to be dangerous, but I'm nowhere near like a decent designer. But I've worked with many great ones. So I basically came up in technology in the Bay Area and the Silicon Valley area around the first .com boom. So I got my start basically as a self-taught freelance web developer, so jumping from company to company. It was the crazy heyday of froth, as folks will remember. So I basically learned how to build websites, build applications with the tools that were available back then. They've changed a lot since then, but most of the principles are still the same. That led to about a decade of running my own web development software outsourcing shop, based out of San Francisco and then later Oakland. With a team of about a dozen engineers. So both like up to my elbows in the code myself, but also kind of running a small business. So I learned a lot about how to be a consultant, how to be and how to run a professional services shop with lots of clients. Some of them were big enterprises everybody's heard of that had overflow tech work that we picked up, and others were first time founders walking in off the street saying, hey, can you help me build my app? So we did many rounds of that sort of work. I got exposed to agile thinking pretty early on in Agile's lifetime, through some good friends who are engineers, and said, hey, you should, if you're going to be running a team, you should look at this stuff. And so I drank deeply from the Agile well and never looked back. Um, a few years later, I feel like I was in a good, privileged situation where I was tipped off to the thinking around lean startup and customer development also pretty early when that was first gaining traction in the area. Looking in retrospect at a lot of the kind of failures of the crash after the .com boom, it was like 10 years later, folks like Steve Blank and Eric Ries and many others were picking up the pieces, and it really resonated with me right away that I, as an engineer and leading my team and working with other teams, had built lots and lots of systems and written lots of lines of code that didn't necessarily find their way into a market because no one bothered to ask the customer. So the way that they were talking about that stuff, leading with experiments and customer development first, totally resonated with me. I didn't need to hear it more than once to pretty much agree that, oh yeah, that's what we haven't been doing since the .com boom. I really got into that as well. And so I had a couple of years, from about 2012 to 2016 or so, where I was a senior technology leader of one sort or another in 4 different organizations, a couple of early stage startups, another company that was a bigger digital agency called Neo, and met a lot of folks who are now good friends and colleagues from that world. Neo was definitely out front and center, waving the flag of lean startup and user-centered design and agile development, kind of in a nice, 3-legged approach to product development. Learned a lot of good stuff from those days, and I did a lot of writing and speaking. So around that time, as a senior consultant in Neo, I was encouraged to be out, kind of developing thought leadership, and because that's how we got business. We were going to conferences and sometimes hosting them, and writing blogs and that sort of thing. And there were a few people that I was working with who were all independently working on books. And so we formed a little book writing club. I'd always thought maybe writing a book would be cool. And that was sort of the impetus that got me to write my book, which took about 2 years to do. But I released the book, Startup Patterns, which was about how great startup teams work, back in 2016. And since around those days, I picked up the name. I used the name Startup Patterns then for my fledgling consulting company that I started around the same time. And that's what I'm still doing now. It's been about 7 years. We've got a small team, based still here in California, but we're a distributed team around the U.S. And we basically do work with any sort of technology company, usually growth stage organizations, but sometimes bigger companies that are building innovation labs or trying to kind of adopt startup-like product development practices. And we work with executives around vision, strategy, OKRs, that sort of thing. We work with the management layer, helping them learn better skills for managing technical product teams, how to embrace autonomy, and be able to delegate better, good communication skills and storytelling. And then we also work with the teams themselves on integrating both product discovery and agile delivery methods, and trying to get them, firing on all cylinders, which brings me to now. So that's basically my story and what I do.
Awesome. Awesome. There's a ton of different cool stuff to dive into there. I appreciate the context. Maybe let's start with Agile, because it sounds like you were a little bit on the ground floor. I mean, what was Agile Manifesto, probably 2001 kind of time frame? Was this kind of the era we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wasn't there, and I think I got a copy of Extreme Programming, Kent Beck's book, probably around that time, and I think I didn't really need it until probably a couple years later after the manifesto, and started to, I had a small team working on a project and started, going online, searching for how does one organize a software development project. And Agile was already starting to become more and more popular as a method. So I think my experience with actively practicing it, ordered every book I could find on it at that time, probably circa 2003, 4, around then. So I wasn't on the first bus, but I was definitely pretty close behind them.
Yeah. What about it stood out to you, or what kind of felt sticky about it to you at the time? Because usually people hear that and there's at least one particular thing that you really glom onto as like, yes, someone said it.
Yeah, definitely. It had to be that. So I started working as a technology person independently in 2000, and as a freelance developer, what you would end up with if you're working on a project is, some folks will undoubtedly remember large, thick, long, many pages requirements documents, right? So we would basically bid on a job. Someone would say, here's my 200-page requirements document. I want you to build this system, and that just seemed like a really dumb way to do things. And I didn't know a lot. I mean, I was still early in my career, but I'd already coded enough to be able to tell that, after a few projects of trying to work that way and then getting towards the end of the project and realizing we missed something or something was hard to interpret, or like we go ta-da and we show them the thing and it doesn't really look at all like what they really wanted. When I started learning about Agile primarily as breaking a large project into small pieces that can be built and demonstrated to the customer and sort of independently verified, building only the littlest bit that you can get away with before moving on to the next one. That, for a software developer, it felt much more natural in terms of our workflow, right? So the
Mm.
idea of, building the entire, database layer first, and then building like the entire, UI on top of it, or whatever, different ways that people approached it. This concept of building fully functional snippets that a user could test, you could deploy, and users could test, just made a lot of sense, from someone who codes. And then as I got into it more, there are a lot of other practices from extreme programming, that I, as I practiced them, and I had some buddies who were also engineers show me how to do test driven development and set up little bits of automation. The continuous integration and CD wasn't even a thing yet. But continuous integration, the tools were pretty clunky and janky, but like once you got them working, it was like magic. Like being able to actually build something in a test first way, where we would just write a little test to see, to basically the tests end up being like specifications, right? So here's what I want the thing to do. And then you fill in just enough code to make it work. And when you get that little green bar or that green checkbox, it's a dopamine hit. You're like,
Mm.
I just
Mm-hmm.
accomplished something. Okay, now I'll move on to the next thing. And so for
Mm-hmm.
engineers, that test driven development kind of flywheel creates a mental space. Folks refer to the concept of flow or being in the zone. Like that's what that is for coders. Like when you're in a zone where you just become really efficient. And so a lot of the technical practices really resonated with me, not because I read about them and they sounded good, like the other stuff, the project management kind of stuff, but with the technical practices, it's more experiential learning. So when you try them, and once you kind of get it figured out and start moving, you can't even imagine building in any other way. So that for me, that was pretty important as well. That I could see that building with those technical practices resulted in higher quality code and better outcomes from a
Mm-hmm.
software developer perspective. So it was kind of a no brainer once I was in.
Yeah, that's so cool, and I love nerding out on this kind of stuff, and I think this is probably why Steve connected us. Just like, especially as I don't know how much you looked at some of these other frameworks. I know you mentioned kind of like diving into the lean startup. Like, it's amazing how you kind of look at the history of these methodologies, how much they're like one sort of is built upon the other, and like there's
Mm-hmm.
something that's like the flavor of the month, and then someone one thing that definitely happens is people over people eventually, like usually we've seen this in a big way with agile, like a bunch of people sort of like implement it poorly or do things in the name of agile that gives agile a bad name, and then someone comes
Yeah.
along and someone rebrands it and goes back to basics, or new technology calls for new ways of thinking. But these methods, like, they all kind of build off one another, or they'll kind of jump industries, and a lot of agile and continuous delivery really borrowed from like automobile manufacturing and lean production,
Absolutely.
and Six Sigma, lean, scrum kind of all has roots in that, and goes back to Toyota production method and Kaizen. And it's just like
Yeah.
all that whole kind of trajectory that you can trace back to got all the way through the 20th century, at least, probably
Yeah.
earlier. But it's
Yeah.
such a cool kind of, once you start to sort of see the patterns of all these, and breaking down work into smaller chunks is a huge kind of thing you see over and over again in all these different methods.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think the more that I've researched over the years the history of some of these industrial methods, it just becomes increasingly apparent that there's this thread running through the way that we work. And it was really interesting. Your reference to Kaizen and lean manufacturing is really important, because I think that what you'll find if one goes looking is that we started at the beginning of the 20th century with kind of mass production, and what we now know, well, what was coined at the time as scientific management by Frederick Winslow Taylor.
Yeah.
And Taylor associated with Ford and the assembly line. There are a lot of folks doing work around that time. Henry Gantt, who we now know from the Gantt chart, they were building systems that could scale, but they were not really designed for quality and for flexibility of the assembly line, right? So the whole first half of the 20th century had this kind of Taylor version of manufacturing. And one of the key things, most people looking to Taylor are familiar with time and motion studies, which wasn't started by Taylor, but he really popularized it. But the other aspect of Taylor that has been so entrenched in our thinking is that he intentionally separated the planning from the doing on the workplace. So like literally into two classes of people. So the planners ultimately became what we think of now as managers, and the folks on the assembly line were the doers. And so there was this real sharp division between the folks who design the process and decide what's going to be done from the people on the ground who were doing these little piecemeal pieces of work on the assembly line. And that was a radical change from the guild system during the 19th century, where, craftsmen, apprentices, journeyman, and master kind of all had the planning, and the doing was in one person or one group. Whereas this new method was separating the thinking process from the doing, and it worked for what they were trying to do at the time, which was increase mass production and industrial output, relative to competitors in Europe and so on. But I think when you look at where lean came from, and around the 30s and 40s, you have a fellow named W. Edwards Deming, who together with folks in Japan like Taiichi Ono from Toyota and other places, basically developed the thinking around lean. And without nerding out too much on the lean specifics, one thing that jumps out that's really different from Taylor is they really focused on the opposite of that. They brought the thinking and the doing back into the workers on the assembly line. And the whole idea behind lean is that, you have continuous improvement, that you have people who are doing the work, are looking around, and are empowered to make decisions and identify areas where the process of doing the work could be improved. And it really pushed the worker back front and center, in teams or individuals, to be able to pull the andon cord and stop the line if there's a problem, right?
The andon cord. People who listen to this show, I've snuck andon cord references into probably 4 episodes now. So
awesome.
We're deep in it, man. Like you're in my territory. I love this.
That's great.
Stuff.
That's great.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So that stuff really connects with Agile too, because I think one of the reasons why we have so much fake Agile is that the mindset of Taylor, even after manufacturing largely abandoned Taylorist manufacturing in 60s, 70s, and 80s, and gradually moved towards lean, the thinking of that managerial class of workers, that separation of kind of command and control and then doing, was still very, very embedded in the white collar industries, which, as manufacturing matured, those industries continued happily on with a command and control culture, and many of them still have it to this day. When you think about where IT kind of came from, it largely came up through the finance department in most large corporations in like the 60s and 70s. And those people were like, the kings of command and control, right? Like so that's, that's our software methodology, like waterfall and stuff like that, came out of that kind of thinking.
It's so interesting. I did a big deep dive. I'm going to forget half the history of it, on like the IT department, the history of the IT department. This was years ago for a different project, but very fascinating. And really there was this like explosion of technology and this race to adopt technology, and suddenly all this blow. And it was, like you said, like finance department, corporate regulators come in. I think like the British government had a big like initiative at the time too, that kind of created what became ITSM. But a lot of like, what the hell are we spending all this money on,
Yeah.
sort of that kind of created the modern IT department. And then like, the kind of famous like Department of No, and you think of like, kind of cliche IT in the 80s and 90s. And it was obviously the sort of 2000s and the internet revolution where it's just like, no,
Right.
this is actually like powering, this is like powering revenue and, powering the business. This isn't like a cost center. This isn't the custodial department. Big shift there. And a lot of enterprises are definitely still locked in the other mentality, but let's bring it back into the 21st century. We've hung out in the 20th century for a while. So you start a couple years ago, you set out to do your book. You start studying, I assume, looking at and working with startups for your book, Startup Patterns. Any particular startups that became kind of like case studies or model examples for your book?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. So lots that probably nobody's ever heard of, right? So the thing about startups is that there are a lot of them, and they're the famous ones are represent a very small percentage of the ones that have been around. I think there were a couple that were kind of interesting to me. So one of the things I did with the book, and I'm working on a new book, so I've been reflecting on the writing process a little bit. It's been a while, but I initially had planned to just sit down and crank out a bunch of principles that I had noticed or observed either from the research or my own work, and just spit that out, and got some feedback from folks that I in this like writing circle that I was in at Neo, and we were all pretty heavily invested in lean thinking, and so I decided to start basically putting some samples of the chapter material on my blog and getting feedback as I was writing the book, which turned out to be a really good thing to do. And some of the feedback I got was that people wanted stories, and so that made a lot of sense. And so I went through my network and looked around the Valley and basically started reaching out to all the startup founders and folks that I knew who I could get on the phone for a call or a coffee, to comment on various aspects of the principles in the book. So, so there were things like, how do you manage the P&L and how do you deal with metrics? There was stuff around around how to organize teams and engineering culture. One group that was really helpful, excuse me, there was a company called ShareThrough that's still around, and I knew them through their co-founder and CTO, Rob Fan, who had given some talks at lean startup conferences where I was also a speaker, and we met and got to chatting back in the day. So I thought of Rob as a person that I could interview about engineering culture. And it is kind of a happy result that I interviewed Rob Fan and his VP of engineering, Rob Slifka, at ShareThrough about how to build a good engineering culture, which had to be in 2015 because I was about halfway finished the book, and then I published it in 2016. And about sometime late last year, Rob made the announcement. So ShareThrough had grown and grown over the years, and then they had a really successful merger with another company based in Canada. And actually ended up doing a little bit of work from them. But I saw on LinkedIn Rob making this announcement that after like, I don't know how many, it must have been 11 or 14 or some number of years since he founded ShareThrough, that he was finally like stepping down to go, basically cashing out. Like he declared success, and I was really happy for him. But it was great because getting to see that, I was like, oh yes, someone I interviewed in the book. It turned out that the principles that they were talking about actually work. And here they are, like, declared a success. And both he and the CEO, I think, decided finally to throw in the towel and pass that successful business on to other leadership. And I was really proud of him. So that was kind of
That's
a
awesome.
nice,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say a coincidence, but you know, a nice
No,
connection there.
that's a win. That's, I'm sure, I think the fear of anyone doing a book with any sort of like nonfiction business tilt is like, man, are these case studies going to bite me in the ass
Yeah,
someday?
5 years
You know,
later, is this going to look really
I,
bad?
I mean, I
And
think
there
it's,
are a few in there that
yeah,
didn't end up doing so well, but there
yeah,
definitely are a handful that
yeah.
I've seen them survive and thrive over the years. When I talk to some of these folks, they were like teams of 5 and 10, and
Hmm.
now they're kind of chugging along. So there are a couple
Yeah.
other examples.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's I think Good to Great, which excellent book, like all the credibility it deserves. But I think the first edition or the first version has famously profiles Circuit City as this
Ooh,
like great like
ouch.
this
Yeah,
as
and
this
that is a
amazing
good book.
success story. Is this amazing success story? And it's like
Yeah.
things turned out differently.
Yeah, or
Um,
think about anyone who's like who profiled WeWork or
oh yeah,
some of
yeah,
the others in
absolutely.
there, a few years ago.
Oh my
These things
gosh.
happen.
So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of I I'm sure you have a lot of telling advice for startups today and uh a lot of startups today and kind of product builders, product development teams are really feeling kind of shaky. Like
Yeah,
the
it's a
macro
difficult
environment's
time.
weird. It's a tough climate. A lot of us who are like vendors trying to sell software are encountering customers who are just sort of in holding patterns and not really like buying or spending right now. So, and then that's hard to, validate product market fit and everything else you're used to doing. So,
Yeah,
what kind of like, I don't know, advice or, patterns, not to not to be too hokey with my
that's all
reference,
right.
like do you find are most sort of like applicable right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it definitely is a shaky time for a lot of people. It's a little bit weird, so I've been through three big downturns in my tech career so far. Um, the .com crash, it was about 01, 02. It didn't last for a super long time, but it was deep and brutal what was happening. And then we had the big one in '08 that kind of ground on for a long time. And I think COVID certainly, like right in the beginning of the pandemic, counts as another one. And what is happening now is a little bit weird in that it's really not like the other ones. It's not quite in the same way. Whereas in 2008, like everybody was down. We had a major housing and fueled banking crisis. Like it
Mm,
was a huge deep recession.
hmm.
And right now that's not actually what's happening, right? So the weird thing about now is that the fundamentals of the economy, at least in the US, and it varies around the world, and I try to keep an eye on that, but US economy is like chugging along, right? Like we've got an unemployment rate of
Yeah,
3.5, which is
yeah.
historically low. And yes, we've been battling inflation, but the labor market is tight. Consumer spending is still pretty upbeat. I mean, I certainly think the interest rates. They announced another, hopefully the last increase yesterday. I mean, that stuff is going to have an impact. We probably will have some kind of recession. Hopefully, it's not too bad, but it's a weird time because it's not like everything has stopped the way it was in '08 or after 9/11. Like
Hmm.
this is sort of like a variegated economy, and so some industries are grinding to a halt, others are still chugging along, healthcare, health tech,
Hmm.
AI obviously is lots of like a few industries that really stand out as chugging along. I also think that um, kind of being a little bit radical here, I'll be pretty frank that I think the big tech layoffs from the big tech companies, certainly the big four. Apple, for some reason, was not totally involved in this, but Google, Meta,
Mm.
Amazon, and others certainly were. There's really not a lot of evidence that they had any reason to execute 5% layoffs other than the fact that salaries for tech workers had gotten so high that they needed to give everybody a big bucket of ice water and put labor back in its place, to
Yeah.
be kind of frank, right?
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of that, unfortunately, was not based in economic fundamentals, but then had the effect
Mm.
of chilling the overall tech economy as everyone saw that, took it really seriously. And
Yeah.
I don't mean to make light at all of the people who were laid off. I know a lot of people that were the victims of those layoffs, and fortunately, a lot of them have been able to pick up jobs after not too long. There's still a lot of jobs out there, but yeah, it was really disruptive, and it made a mess. And so, I think there's a lot of head scratching and a lot of anger at the big tech companies why they felt the need to pull that maneuver. And I think
Yeah.
it'll be remembered the next time they're trying to do a recruiting push at the other
Mhm.
end of the economy.
Yeah.
People will remember how sort of cold and heartless, those layoffs were even executed. So back to your question. So that's the environment that
Mhm.
we're in, which is to say it's not a recession yet. It's certainly not a depression. It's not, business has not ground to a halt, but there's a lot of uncertainty there. Like companies are slashing budgets. They are slowing down on hiring. There's a real measurable impact. And so I think for any startup, one of the things to keep in mind is that your own profitability and kind of really paying close attention to the unit economics of what you're doing, it has always been important. And it's especially important when people are kind of sometimes ask me about, hey, we're thinking about whether we should raise money. Should we raise money? It's not as much of an issue right now because it's super hard to raise money. But, when I get into conversations with people about that, I usually tell them, like, the best time to raise money is when you don't need it, right? Like, if you're in a position where you can't really operate without the extra capital, the VCs have you over a barrel, and that's not a
Mm.
good time to get a term sheet, right? So, that doing investment, I've always found, like, you can avoid it as long as you can, to the point where that you've got product market fit, and adding capital is just gonna fuel growth with relative certainty, and you have better terms at that point. So I think that with that in mind, a lot of the capital is drying up anyway. For now, it'll be back. Like, capital needs
For
to be
sure.
invested or it dies. Like, they're going to have to put it somewhere.
For sure.
But companies should focus on the fundamentals and focus on, like, what is your core competency? Who is your core customer and what's your core value proposition? And really get back to basics and make sure that teams are focused on, doing whatever that one job is for your customer really, really well, and just focusing on that and not getting distracted too much by what everybody else is doing. Of course, you got to pay a little bit of attention to the trends and where's the market going. But I think that all these companies that are like, oh, we got to, like, add chat GPT to our products, like, slap it on the side just so that, like, people think we're an AI company, are
Yeah.
not really looking at this in a very sober and clear-eyed way. I think
Mhm.
it takes a little more thoughtfulness. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
the fundamentals are really important.
Yeah, and that's a great, what better way to have a pulse on sort of like the real world and the real customer and get outside the, sort of AI hype noise with than like kind of being out there in maybe some of those more traditional industries that aren't tech. Like if tech is, shaky and kind of having a existential crisis right now, like you said, like there's other parts of the economy that are functioning, and we've all, sometimes you can't help it, but a lot of startups are sort of snake eating their own tail where they're only serving other tech vendors. And,
Yeah,
some products do that, like, no, obviously, but if you can sell to airlines, insurance companies, hospitals, like
supermarkets.
those industries, yeah, they're all powered by software. They all
Yeah,
need software. So that, I think, is the nice advantage of, of
yeah.
being in tech, is like we are still in a world where software is powering everything and continues to do so. So I think
Yeah,
the
and
macro
yet
outlook, the long term is super optimistic.
absolutely. And there's still a lot of industries that have a long way to go in terms of digitization too. It's not like a completely done deal. I was talking to someone, a friend of mine who's running product at a company that is trying to digitally transform, supply chain and inventory information for grocery stores.
Oh,
And,
cool. Yeah.
they're still seeing paper.
Mm.
I kid you not. There's still like paper
Hmm.
and pencil on clipboard being walked around stores all over America. Right. And so,
Yeah.
like, the
Yeah.
challenge for them is not how do you build a smart enough AI that can predict supply and demand curves, but how do we get all these people to type this stuff in so that we have the data and it's not on
Oh my
paper
gosh.
anymore? So,
Yeah.
like, there are still a lot of opportunities like that for industries or parts of industries that still are in the 90s or even 80s, so to speak, technologically. And there's a lot more work to be done in terms of adding, technical efficiency and transforming some of those industries. So
Yeah.
that stuff hasn't gone away yet.
I want to jump to, I feel like you'll be great for book recommendations. Obviously, you've talked a lot about writing and the history of all this stuff. So I know there's some great book recommendations. What do you recommend the most? Or yeah, what are some of your favorite books to either gift or recommend?
Oh man. Yeah, the worst thing about this question is having to choose.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so many. I think that, a couple come to mind right away. I think for people who are um, currently in the trenches, as it were, product managers, engineers, designers working on stuff now, there's no question in my mind that uh, Teresa Torres' Continuous Discovery Habits is a must
Hmm.
read
Hmm.
for anyone building products. I'd also recommend Melissa Perry's The Build Trap, another critical read. And sort of on the other side of the stool, the three-legged stool, one book that's really excited me over the last couple of years, I can't seem to stop talking about, is Team Topologies. Team Topologies really
Mm.
uh, really covers a lot of interesting ground about how team structures should be organized in a technology company. And it was really a breath of fresh air. It's not, it's been out for a few years now, but it's still kind of making
Hmm.
its way and spreading. And what's nice about it is it really puts to bed a lot of debates about how teams building technology should be organized, because it's based on many years of data and research across a vast range of sources. Um, Taking Conway's law, for folks who aren't familiar, it's simply that the for organizations building technology, they tend to create architectures in the technology that mirror the communication patterns of the organization.
Hmm.
And that's been around for a long time. Martin Conway wrote about it in 1964. It's still true. But really looking at the research around Conway's law, team topologies, I think, shows that organizing teams basically around value streams versus kind of platform or service teams that feed those value streams. And then there's a couple of other specialized team types. Um, that book really saves a lot of pointless debate that I see
Hmm.
engineering teams and engineering leaders getting into all the time. Because, a lot of times what happens is you'll have problems in the workflow and things are slowing down and we're not sure why we're not shipping as fast. And there's a real tendency for executives to want to do a reorg because
Mm.
it's like the one hammer in their bag. They're like, okay, I don't know
Yeah.
what's going on, so I'm just gonna
Yeah.
shuffle everybody around and
Shuffle the
hope
deck.
that it improves things, right? So, like,
Gosh.
the dreaded reorg is the kind of tool of last resort. Whereas I think if folks used a little science, a little research, and looked at what the folks at Team Topologies are talking about, they've answered all those questions for you already. So just apply the patterns at work. So
Very
those are some
cool.
of my favorites for sure.
Yeah.
There are many others, but I'll
Yeah.
stop there.
That's awesome. I've heard good things about team topologies. I have not read that, so I'll have to pick it up. I've got a recommendation for you just based on this conversation that I think you'll enjoy, because I get the picture that you've got the whole agile lean Toyota canon down already. I'm not going to hit you with anything new there, but a popular framework in a different industry. This is sort of like a out of the way book that is sort of an out of the way concept. Do you know this? Have you ever worked in a restaurant? Do you know what mise en place? There's a term, mise en place.
Mise en place. Oh yeah,
the French term, everything in its place.
Yeah. I'm an amateur chef. I've never worked in restaurants, so but I appreciate cooking.
Mise en place is this excellent, think of it like agile. It's a methodology for a framework and a set of principles, cultures for, how to do your work.
Yeah.
In the restaurant, handed down, through oral tradition, like generations, like from restaurant to restaurant. That's a very like kind of tight knit community. And it's just like, it's been this like literally like unspoken set of rules that has made its way through, culinary academies, 5-star restaurants, fine dining, the whole world, that world operates on mise en place. No one ever wrote it down. So a few years back, this guy, basically, he went to the Culinary Institute of America, studied all those like fine dining restaurants, famous chefs, French Laundry, all that. And basically like wrote this like kind of history and text on mise en place. So the book is called Everything in Its Place.
Yes.
And it's just so cool. And it's such a cool framework because like battle tested across this massive environment over years, passed down over generations, not, the mise en place academy figured it out. Like this is like ground up shit.
Wow.
And this guy like studied it and wrote it all down. It's a very, very cool book. Yeah. If you're an amateur chef and like all this other stuff, like this is the overlap. It's very, very cool.
Wow, Blake, you totally have my number there, man. I'm going to order that book immediately after this call.
Check it out. Shoot me
sounds awesome.
Shoot me a note when you, after you read it, let me know what you think. I hope it's a good recommendation because I loved it, man. Yeah. It's really, and it gets into all the kind of agile lean stuff about like order of operations and prep and why they do this and that order and that
timing and
exactly all that stuff. And you're like, this is like like a mature, manufacturing operation. This is a very mature operation happening here. And I love under the radar stuff like that, where it's like people write it off because it's, it's blue collar, or there's not management consultants figuring it out or whatever. But some of the principles they've codified.
Thank God there aren't management consultants.
I know. Yeah. Oh my God.
I wouldn't eat that stuff.
I know. Yeah. No management consultants were involved in the preparation of this menu. That's amazing. Dude, I could talk about this stuff all day. I'm sure you could too. Let me leave one more fun question here,
sure.
And then we can wrap up, because I like to ask product people about products. What's a product either for work, or it could just be like, something at home, like B2B, B2C, your pick. What's a cool product you're excited about lately?
All right. I'm going to pick something a little off the wall. And I don't care if people think that I'm getting old or I'm boring, but I've got this great app on my phone called Merlin. And it is a bird identifying app from ornithologists. And it is awesome because I live in Petaluma. I moved out to the country during the pandemic.
Awesome. Yeah.
And it's really nice and rural around here. And there's a lot of birds. We got some trees in the yard. And so I walk outside to go to the car, and I'm hearing these interesting bird calls. And there's a button on my phone on this app called Sound ID. And I can just push it and it'll start recording, and it'll show you the sort of the waveforms that are coming in that it's hearing. And in real time, cool. As it's hearing the bird calls, it'll pull up and identify each of them, and you can save the recording and play it back. And there's all this interesting information. And so
that's awesome.
Someone told me about it, and I started playing with it, just, taking a walk or being, out in a field or something. And I'm like totally addicted to it. It's like so awesome. Fascinating. And so I can actually identify certain bird calls in the neighborhood that I've become accustomed to, because I hear them all the time. and my brain has validated like, oh yeah, that's a red-winged blackbird, or
Oh my
that's a
God.
northern flicker. So
That's so cool.
it's good for both. Being in nature is really good for the brain and for relaxation, and there's lots of health benefits. And this kind of like, it's like I sort of gamify my nature walks, because I can sort of
That's
guess and then
awesome.
see if I'm right.
That's amazing. And I'm sure, Marin County is a great place to be for that, man.
Totally,
That's
totally.
so, I'll have to check that out. We have a 3-year-old and we just got a bird feeder, and it was, he got to pick the bird
Oh
feeder, and
yeah.
we set it up right outside the living room window, which is so cool because like he's so excited to like see the birds. And so he's like, there's a bird there and there's another bird. And he's like, we can sit there and watch the birds come to his bird feeder. He's just delighted, which makes it so fun to do together. And he started to like, that's a cardinal. That's
Oh yeah.
it's like the brown bird's here. The bird with the orange beak is back.
Yeah.
And it's just like so cool. So I got to
That's
grab this, and
awesome.
we'll start putting a face to names on these birds
Yeah,
because
and this app,
he's having fun.
it'll do photo recognition as well. So I
Yes.
mostly use the sound one because I'm not usually close enough, but it has
Yes.
the visual IDs as well. So you could just line it right up outside the window and
All right.
validate which birds they are.
Merlin. All right, I'm gonna hit them up for some sponsorship bucks because we gave a
Totally.
glowing awesome. This
Yeah, it's the
this episode brought to you
Cornell
by Merlin.
Ornithology Lab. Yeah.
Fantastic. Oh my gosh, this was super fun, Sam. Appreciate you
Yeah.
being on
This is
today.
great.
Really had fun. Yeah, man. So the book is Startup Patterns. We'll drop a link in the show notes here so folks can find that. Otherwise, if people want to like get in touch, reach out, say hey, where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So startuppatterns.com is our website. You can get the book there. We also have our blog with lots of other thoughts and information about what we do. And I'm working on a new book too. So that's a good place. If you sign up for our newsletter, we'll keep you posted on when the new book is coming out, probably in the next couple months. And I'm also super active on LinkedIn, and I love to talk to people and meet new people. So if folks want to connect with me there, I'm very happy to talk to people about product or other aspects of technology or the economy or whatever else.
Yeah.
So I certainly welcome those LinkedIn connections.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here, Sam. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Blake. This is great.
Yep. See ya.